All right, guys. So in this video, I'm going to talk about conditioning, and specifically, I'm going to talk about classical conditioning. Um, and classical conditioning begins with Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov was actually uh, a physiologist, um, and he was interested in the digestive process of animals and people, and he was actually studying saliva. And so for his studies, he needed a lot of saliva. And so what he did was he would kind of surgically implant this hose onto dogs, and he could attach a vial to that. Uh, then he would feed the dogs just a type of meat powder so that when the dogs ate it or it touched their tongue, they would salivate at its taste. It would create a lot of saliva, and then he could use that his uh, for his studies. But Pavlov noticed something. He noticed that sometimes the dogs would start to salivate without being given any meat powder. And he kind of deduced that it had something to do with the white lab coats the assistants used before they gave the dogs the meat powder. In other words, the dogs saw the white lab coats, and the dogs knew that when the assistants had the white lab coats, it usually meant that they were going to get fed. And so the dogs would start to salivate. And Pavlov decided he wanted to check if he could um, do this on purpose, if he could condition or teach the dogs to salivate at a specific stimulus. Okay. Now, what he did was that he had two stimuli and a response. So, a stimulus is something that you can see, smell, taste, or touch. And so for Pavlov, the stimuli were the meat powder, which he already knew made the dog salivate, and he decided to use a bell. A bell, something that the dog had never, felt before or sensed before. Why use something like a bell? Well, you see, the thing is that the meat powder, the taste of the meat powder naturally or normally or automatically creates salivation in the dogs. And so this is what we call an unconditioned stimulus and then unconditioned response. Unconditioned here means not learned. Okay. And then the stimulus is a stimulus and a response is the reaction. Now, a bell does not naturally or automatically make a dog salivate, right? Hearing a bell might make the dog turn to look at the bell or bark even, but dogs don't salivate to bells. No one salivates to bells. Um, so the bell is what we call the neutral stimulus. It's neutral because it's not giving us the desired response, in this case, salivation. But of course, what classical conditioning can do is that it can make the dog salivate to the sound of the bell, to the neutral stimulus. Now, I want to make sure that I say this. Think of the phrase unconditioned or the word unconditioned as not learned. So, what are we going to do? Uh, we're going to put those together. And that's what Ivan Pavlov did. So, he would ring a bell and then he'd give the dogs the food powder. And the dogs salivated naturally to the food powder. Now you can't do this just once, right? You're learning. And so you have to do it over and over and over again. And eventually the dogs will get it. So Pavlov does it again, rings the bell, gives the dogs the food powder, and then the dogs salivate because of the food powder. And again, ring the bell, give the dogs the food powder, and the dogs salivate because of the food powder. But if you do this enough times, then something will happen. That neutral stimulus is going to change on us and is going to become the conditioned stimulus. Okay. Why? because now the bell by itself is going to make the dog salivate, even if you never give the dogs the food powder. This is a learned reaction. The term conditioned here, think of that as meaning learned. Conditioned stimulus, the stimulus that was learned, and conditioned response, the response that was learned. You'll notice that it's the same response. The unconditioned response and the conditioned response, they're both salivation. And the same thing is true with the conditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus. Both of those are the same. They're both the bell. Um, it's just that in the beginning, the bell doesn't give you a response, and then at the end, the the dogs have learned to respond to the bell by salivating. All right, please pause this video and watch the YouTube video about Dave and his roommate Brian, and then I'll go over what you saw and how that's related to classical conditioning. Okay, so what you will have noticed is that Dave uses uh, two stimuli as well, the airsoft gun and a button that says that was easy. Both of these are our stimuli. Why? Because you can feel one of them and you can hear the other. But only one of them gives you a response or the response normally. Being hit by the airsoft gun pellet, that creates the flinching effect that Dave is looking for. The easy button doesn't do that, not naturally. Um, and so, therefore, the easy button is our neutral stimulus. Again, if you're unsure, um, remember that our unconditioned stimuli and response, it means that that's not learned. You don't need to learn to flinch when someone shoots you with an airsoft gun. That happens naturally. What does not happen naturally is to flinch to the easy button. The easy button might have other responses. You might look towards it, um, but it doesn't make you flinch. But of course, what Dave is trying to do is make Brian flinch by the sound of the easy button. So what does he do? He puts them together. And so he hits the easy button. That was easy. And then he shoots Brian, and Brian flinches. And again, you can't just do that once. You have to do it over and over and over again. So Dave hits the easy button, shoots Brian, and Brian flinches. And then again, he does it a couple more times. Easy button, shoots Brian, Brian flinches. But what you saw there at the end is that the last time Dave hit the easy button, that was easy, it said. And without having to shoot Brian, Brian flinched just at the sound of the easy button. So what do we have here? Now we have a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. Remember, conditioned here is the learned stimulus, the easy button, to the conditioned or learned response, which is flinching. Now, there are a lot of behaviors, you have a lot of reactions you have that have been classically conditioned into you. Um, most, or the one that's most obvious, is advertising. Advertising uses classical conditioning to get you to respond the way they want you to respond, uh, so that then you'll buy their product. A lot of times you'll see I don't know, maybe like a beer commercial, and then there's girls in bikinis. And people will sometimes tell you the reason they put girls in bikinis uh, in the commercial is because they want people to think, guys to think, that if you drink that beer, girls in bikinis will like you. And that's not quite right. No one is quite that gullible. Some people are, but most people are not quite that gullible. And so what's happening is a little more subtle and has everything to do with classical conditioning. So let me show you an example here. So we still need two stimuli to work. Our first stimulus is going to be uh, the the product, the logo, or the logo name, or the brand name, and then the other stimuli is going to be the commercial, and the commercial is usually a story or a little bit of a gimmick or a song that is going to give you some sort of response because we everybody here knows what Coca-Cola is, but if you didn't, Coca-Cola by itself can't give you a response. Not if you don't know what it is. And so the people who make a commercial that's going to elicit an emotion from you. Um, and they go to all lengths to make sure that they can pull on your heartstrings or make you laugh or create some emotion in you. This is going to be our unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. If you see a sappy story, you don't have to learn to react to that, to cry or to laugh if they make a joke, right? You don't have to learn that. The story by itself is going to elicit the emotion. So this is unlearned, unconditioned. Um, Now, in a world where we don't know what Coca-Cola is, the logo of Coca-Cola does not create an emotion. But of course, what the commercial wants to do is to get you to feel the emotion whenever you see the Coca-Cola logo. And so what do? They put them together, just like Pavlov's, just like Dave. They will put the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. And they get very good at doing this. So um, the neutral stimulus will be the logo, and then they show you a commercial. And the commercial, the little baby bear loses his Coke and he's going after it, and it's hard and it's kind of funny. And then mom saves the day. And the feeling is like, oh, that's nice. I like that. And they can show you that same commercial over and over again. That'll work. But of course, we know that sometimes they don't do that. Sometimes they'll change up the commercial and they'll show Big Mean Joe, and he snaps at everybody. But then the little boy offers him a Coke, and then Big Joe Green will give the boy the his jersey. And again, the idea is you go, oh, that's nice. I like that little story. It just pulls at your heartstrings. And again, they might show you a completely different one or the same one over and over and over again. And all the friends are going out, but the cashier can't leave because he's working, even though he seems to like the girl. And then at the very end, she has saved him a Coke with his name on it, and you go, "Oh, that's so nice. I really like that." And this happens over and over and over again. Um, the idea is that one day you're going to be at the supermarket or at the convenience store, and you're going to have to choose which sugar water you want to drink. And they're all basically the same because they're all sweet sugar water. But what they want you to do is they want you to choose theirs. So all of the commercials should get you to react to the logo. And now just seeing the logo by itself is going to get you to turn on that emotion of awe or just happiness. And that confuses your brain. And you go, Coke, that's my favorite. It has to be my favorite. How else do I explain how happy I am to have this Coke? Well, it's kind of easy to explain if you know classical conditioning. You were conditioned to have a reaction to the logo through all those years of commercials that you watched. But most of us don't make that connection. And so we go, Coke or whichever logo, this one's my favorite because look, it makes me feel happy just to have it. Again, remember that conditioned here means learned. Uh, Kind of the same thing happens when you go off to vote. Every election cycle, you're going to hear politicians say something along the lines of, I'm not going to go negative. I'm only going to tell my constituents what I stand for, and what I believe in, and let them make their own choice. But you know what happens? As soon as their uh, points, their poll points start to go down, they switch back to giving commercials because they want to classically condition a part of the electorate. So, how do they do it? Well, kind of similarly to the Coke, except that instead of trying to make you feel happy, they're going to try to make you feel angry. It's hard to do a political um, commercial and make everybody kind of feel happy or pull at their heartstrings too much, because then it becomes too obvious, and if you figure out what they're trying to do, it's easier to stop the effects of the classical conditioning. So instead, what they'll do is that they'll show you the opposite. They're going to create a commercial that is going to make you angry, and the way that's going to be your unconditioned stimulus and your unconditioned response. And your neutral stimulus is going to be the other guy, the other politician, the one that they want you to vote against. And then, just like all the other ones, they're going to put them together, and they're going to say, Quimby, he steals money from your grandma. And you're going to go, what? This guy, he's awful. And they'll say something else. Quimby, he hates your dog. And you're like, what? This guy is just the worst. Quimby, he steals candies from babies. And you're, what? This guy is the very worst person. And again, just like before, you see this all the time. Sometimes you're not even paying attention to it. You're having breakfast and the commercial is just on in the background. But the idea is that one day you're going to be at that polling place, and maybe you don't even remember the name Quimby. You don't really remember who you want to vote for. But when you read his name, Quimby, you go, no, that name sounds bad. That sounds like someone who would kick my dog. And so I'm going to vote for the other guy, right? So the name Quimby makes you feel angry. I'm not sure why, but it makes you kind of feel angry. And so you vote for the other person. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but this absolutely works. Politicians pay millions of dollars to get their ads on TV because this absolutely works. You can condition someone to have an emotional reaction to a person's name in this scenario. I want to talk a little bit about John B. Watson. John B. Watson was a researcher, and he did research on a little kid that most of us know as Little Albert. That wasn't really the little kid's name, it was a pseudonym to protect his identity. But of course, we've become obsessed with Little Albert. Everybody wants to know who he is. We're really not 100% sure. Why? Because John B. Watson was sure that he could classically condition anyone to be a good person or a bad person. And with little Albert, what he was trying to do is to classically condition little Albert to have a phobia. So what did he do? He tried to create a classical conditioning response here to a white rat. It's hard to see because it's a black and white picture, but in the upper left, you see John B. Watson, and almost in the middle there, you see the little baby. And if you look towards the baby's hand, you might be able to make out the rat. And as you can see, little Albert is not afraid of the rat. He tries to play with him. So again, we have two stimuli. The rat And then something that naturally makes babies cry, which is a loud noise. Um, Specifically, what John B. Watson used was hitting a pipe, a metal pipe, with a hammer, and that would make an awful clang sound. And little babies don't like loud noises, especially if they don't know where the loud noise is coming from. And so, this is our unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. You don't have to teach a baby to be afraid of loud noises. They come that way. They're naturally going to be afraid of loud noises. What we know little Albert is not afraid of is a white rat, because in the beginning, little Albert played with the white rat just fine. So our white rat is our neutral stimulus. Neutral because it does not create the response. So now, what Watson did is he let the rat go, and the rat kind of played around, walked around until he got very close to little Albert. And when little Albert was going to touch the rat, as soon as his hands came near the rat, they would bang the pipe, and little Albert would cry to the sound of the bang. And again, you can't do that just once. You have to do it over and over again. So they take the rat away, they calm down little Albert, and then they bring the rat back in. Uh, the rat walks around until it gets close enough for little Albert to try to touch it. And just as little Albert tries to touch it, they bang the pipe. And then, of course, little Albert cries. And again, they let the rat out, they clang the pipe, and then little Albert cries to the clang. After they do this a few times, then our neutral stimulus becomes our conditioned stimulus. And now, even before the rat gets close, as soon as little Albert sees the rat, he starts to cry, because now our rat has become our conditioned stimulus, and the crying has become the conditioned response. Um, Now, it's important to point out that we can generalize stimuli. So let's say that a dog bites you, Fido bites you. Well, it makes sense to be afraid of Fido. Fido is a bad dog. But sometimes people generalize that fear. And now they are not just afraid of Fido, but they're afraid of all dogs. We call this generalization. You apply what you learned to Fido to other things that are similar to Fido. For little Albert, that meant that he wasn't just afraid of white rats. Really became afraid of anything that was white and fluffy. So there was a bunny, and he would cry when he saw the bunny. And there was a coat that had a little bit of seal skin and fur on it. And when little Albert saw the fur, he would cry. And there was a Santa Claus mask that they used in the experiment. Before, he didn't cry at the Santa Claus mask, but after, he had generalized his fear of the rat to the fluffy beard in the Santa Claus mask. And so, again, this is a generalization. In uh, Pavlov's dogs, Pavlov tried to do another experiment with a whistle, but the dogs generalized what they had learned about the bell to the whistle. And so whenever Pavlov blew the whistle, the dogs would salivate anyway. Now, animals can also discriminate between the stimuli. Now, discriminate here doesn't mean to put other people down. It's not a racial or gender issue here. Discrimination here means being able to tell things apart, right? Being able to discriminate between a bell and a whistle. And in the case of Pavlov's dogs, what Pavlov did was he kind of conducted another experiment. And whenever he blew the whistle, he would not feed the dogs. But whenever he rang the bell, he did feed the dogs. And so what happens, the dogs learn to discriminate between the sound of the whistle and the sound of the bell. You do this too, right? Sometimes your mom calls your name and she has a sharp tone to it. And sometimes she calls your name and she has a soft tone to it. And even though it's your mom's voice, and even though she's saying the same thing, your name, you can discriminate between the tones of voices. Um, I have different ringtones to different people. So my best friend has a specific ringtone, and my mom has a specific ringtone, and my sisters have their own. And I know how to discriminate between them. When my phone rings, I know immediately, before I even think about it, who is calling me because I'm used to hearing the different ringtones. So this is I can discriminate between them. I think I kind of already spoke about generalization, so I want to talk very quickly here about ethics. What uh, Watson did was incredibly unethical. Um, if Watson tried to do this today, he would be removed from his post. There's a good chance people would boycott him. I think it's important to point out that Watson eventually did lose his job, but not because what he did to little Albert. He lost his job because he was caught having an affair. And back then, that was something that was just incredibly taboo. Um, and no one cared about little kids. And so they didn't care that he had given a child a phobia and had never even tried to take away the uh, the phobia after he gave it to the child. Um, Later on, we also learn that little Albert might have had a mental condition. We're not 100% sure that this is true, but people who make it their business to try to figure out things like this think that little Albert might have been a kid in a hospital who eventually died from an infection in the brain. It didn't have anything to do with Watson's experiment, but of course, Watson's experiment was not helpful in the least. Um, it is a possibility that uh, that is not little Albert. There are other researchers who don't think that boy who died was little Albert. But in any case, there's still an ethical problem there. If little Albert lived into adulthood, did he have this phobia forever, or was he able to overcome it? We're completely unsure. Today, this research would probably never happen because there are more ethical guidelines now than there used to be. And of course, Watson had the ability to reverse the uh, the classical conditioning of the phobia, but he never even tried. Now, how can you reverse these? Well, there's a couple of things that you might try. Um, there is what we call counter conditioning, which is just changing the relationship between the stimulus and the response. We see this with people who have phobias. You might get them to stare at a picture of a dog and help them overcome their fear. And once they do, maybe you bring in a puppy and they'll get them to uh, pet the puppy. And at first, it's going to cause a lot of anxiety. But if you get them to pet the puppy, and of course nothing happens, they'll start to be able to break the conditioning, the learned response that they had created. Another way to break a habit or a conditioned response is to what we call aversive conditioning. We do this when instead of having a positive reaction, we try to give you a negative reaction. So, or I say a negative stimulus to pair with. So, let's say that you are a smoker. Well, if I can get you to feel nauseated by the cigarette, now every time you see the cigarette, you're going to feel nauseated. And you then will stop smoking because of that. This works with some people who use drugs like Chantix. It doesn't work like this way for everybody, but um, with Chantix, you are able to take a drug, and this drug really doesn't do anything to you. You don't feel anything, and you can keep on smoking. But this drug, unbeknownst to you, is blocking your ability to get that little high, that little buzz that you get when you smoke. And so now all that's left over is how bad that cigarette tastes in your mouth. And then you start to feel nauseated because of that. And now you're much more likely to associate cigarettes with feeling bad. And so you try to not smoke. There is a gum that works like this for sweet tasting things. So again, you eat the gum and the gum just feels like it's a regular gum, but unbeknownst to you, is blocking the receptors in your taste buds. And so the next time you see a nice piece of cake and you eat it, it doesn't taste sweet, and the shock of it not tasting sweet makes you gag. Imagine if you've probably had the feeling of you thought something was Sprite, but it turned out to be water, or vice versa. You thought that it was water and it turned out to be Sprite. And sometimes the shock kind of makes you grossed out by it. Um, well, that same thing happens. The shock of this is supposed to taste sweet and then it doesn't makes you feel nauseated. And if you do this long enough, then you're going to start feeling nauseated by all sweet foods. And so you're less likely to eat it. For little Albert, this still would have been difficult because he was so young that it would have been hard to do either of these to get him to overcome the phobia. But Watson didn't even try. And so this is why we think of his study as being incredibly unethical, even though it's incredibly interesting. All right, so I want to talk very briefly about a type of classical conditioning that we call biological preparedness or taste aversion. So there are certain things that uh, if you pair them together, you don't have to do it over and over and over again. You only need to pair them once. And so some things have to do with pain. Certain pain uh, stimuli, if you pair them with pain, they will come together automatically and you'll learn it forever, even though it only happened once. And the same thing happens with things like nausea and the taste. If you eat something and quickly after you eat it, you feel nauseated or tired or just feverish, that will automatically associate, your brain will automatically associate whatever you ate with how you're feeling. Now, let me give you an example. When I was a kid, my mom bought an enormous bag of pistachios. And it was the 80s, and no one cared about little kids back then. So my mom left to my grandma's house, and I stayed in my home by myself. I must have been like 4 or 5. And I proceeded to eat the entire bag of pistachios. And of course, I gorged myself, and the feeling of being sort of gorged with a specific food made me feel kind of sick, right? So here we have my two stimuli, the nuts themselves, and then the feeling of being stuffed and grossed out by the food. And so what happened was I didn't have to do this over and over again. Once was enough, and my my neutral stimulus went from being a neutral stimulus to becoming a conditioned stimulus. And now the feeling sick um, made what is associated with the nuts instead of being associated with having gorged myself. And so for the rest of my life, all the way until today, I hate pistachios. Um, there was a time where I had generalized that disgust to all nuts. and I couldn't eat peanuts or almonds uh, or any other kind of nuts. With time, I've been able to overcome that, but I still hate pistachios. Even though I know exactly why I hate them, it doesn't change the fact that I just look at them and they make me feel grossed out. And this only happened once, but in biological preparedness or conditioned taste aversion, that's all it takes is one pairing, and you have learned the connection forever. Why would this happen? Well, the reason we call it biological preparedness is because there are certain things that you need to be prepared to learn. And one of them is that some foods make you sick. And so we kind of come pre programmed that if a food makes you sick, to hate it forever. Because if we were cavemen, we don't want to try to eat the same foods 2 and 3 and 4 times, because by the second time, it might just end up killing you. You want to learn that the first time. Doctors use this for chemo patients, especially children that are on chemotherapy. The chemotherapy by itself makes you feel nauseated. And then what happened to me with the nuts will happen to the child who is taking chemotherapy with whatever they eat next, the meat and potatoes they had for dinner. And then they'll hate meat and potatoes forever, which we can't have because we need this kid to get their nutritional needs met so that they can get strong again quickly. So, what the doctors will do is that they will give the child what we call a scapegoat flavor. And so, as the child is getting chemotherapy, they'll be given a lollipop. And in this case, that looks like cherry. So, that eventually, when the chemotherapy is over, the child will feel nauseated and maybe they'll even throw up. But they will associate the nausea with the lollipop. And so now the child will feel nauseated to the taste of cherry lollipops, uh, and they'll hate them forever. But they'll eat their meat and potatoes later on, and they'll get the nutritional value out of that. And so we just kind of sacrifice one flavor so that the child won't end up being nauseated by all foods for the rest of their life, or at least during their chemotherapy. Now, uh, with conditioned taste aversion is that connection to foods, but really, uh, internal stimuli are always associated with taste, and pain is usually associated with external stimuli. If any of those occur together, then the classical conditioning response will occur with just one pairing. So internal stimuli is going to include things like feeling sick or nauseous, feeling congested or tired. All of those are internal feelings. Um, and so if you eat a food and that food makes you feel tired, you will make that association right away. External stimuli, that is associated with pain. So seeing a fire, if the fire burns, you only need one pairing with that. You see an animal, the animal bites you, you only need one pairing with that. You will create a fear of that, whatever you saw, immediately, because you will associate it with the pain.